So we can't see anyone, so I think we're meant to hold these, but I guess we are. Thank you first of all, I should say, to NatWest, but seriously, real big thanks as well to Nick for making time to come and talk to us. We can see from this turnout. And there's an upgraded room. There's an awful lot of interest in hearing what Nick's got to say, and of course, because there's been a large influx of new members into the Liberal Democrats, there's probably people here who haven't heard Nick in conferences before. The introduction, as someone shouted out, "Tell us who you are," doesn't really need doing, does it? Dozen years, an MP for Sheffield Hallam, leader for 8 years, and then deputy PM, of course, for 5. More impressive for me than any of it is being able to speak 5 languages. But let's just go back, Nick, at the beginning, just how you got into politics. Because when I heard your Desert Island Discs, even before I'd read about the teenage conviction for burning cactuses, you don't strike me as the type of person who, Michael Heseltine style, plotted a path to the top at a very young age. Was politics obviously for you when you were young?
No, not remotely. Nor is being a Liberal Democrat a way of plotting a way to the top. No, it actually it sort of crept up on me, I think, like it does on many people. I came from a family that was, I think, how can I put it, was sort of aware of the importance of politics, but not a sort of party political family. So partly just because of the rather sort of roundabout checkered history of my parents' family. So my mum was Dutch, was born in Indonesia and spent her formative years in a Japanese prisoner of war camp, and my dad, whose mum, my grandmother, was Russian and was part of that Russian diaspora. So there was a sort of there was quite a sort of almost unspoken feeling that big political things can have big effects for better or for worse. So I was kind of interested in politics, and I'm 50 now, so I was part of that generation. So I was at school in the 70s and so on, and at university in the mid-80s. So I was very, very much part of that generation that either reacted for or against Thatcherism. So I was very galvanised by that. And again, looking back on it, it's actually quite instructive when you think about the sort of the kind of Corbyn mania. Well, it wasn't about a policy. I mean, the poll tax didn't affect me as a non-taxpayer. It was just, I remember the thing that offended me more than anything else as a youngster was when I was told she had said, though she subsequently denied it, that there's no such thing as society. This kind of angered me immensely. And then the anti-Europeanism, that sort of angered me immensely. So I was part of that generation that reacted very badly to Thatcherism. So it sort of crept up on me, and then I won't bore you with all the twists and turns, but I think it probably was, which is odd where I'm sort of ended up now. I'm only really now speaking out on Europe, but actually, when I look back on it, Europe was probably the most proximate cause for my reason for entering into politics, because I worked not in a party capacity, but as a lonely EU trade negotiator for Leon Britton, who was then the vice president of the European Commission under Jacques Delors. And I was an official, I was just a sort of civil servant, so I was speaking way out of my turn. I kept sort of saying how awful I thought it was that the government was doing this, that, and the other. And I remember he sort of turned around in impatience one day and said, "Oh, for heaven's sake, instead of constantly going on about what you don't like on the television, why don't you actually get into politics yourself?" And I was uncharacteristically just lost for words, because I just thought, because like most people, I just thought politicians were another species, from another galaxy, as most people probably regard me now. And it was the first time someone said, "No, you can do that. You can enter that world."
So can I just press you then on, was he wanting you to join as a Conservative, or was he neutral at that?
Well, he knew I was a Lib Dem. And I remember him, when I first said, no, I was hoping to stand, because I subsequently then stood as a Euro candidate for the Liberal Democrats. So when I first told him that, I remember he scoffed. He said, "Oh, for heaven's sake, it's like an NGO." Plus ça change. No, to be fair to him, actually, I remember laughing with him actually shortly before his death that when I worked for him, I don't think there was a single Conservative in his private office. He was quite ecumenical like that, but he wasn't. Anyway, he wasn't in the European Commission to just sort of serve Conservative Party ends, but he was very relaxed about being advised by people who were not Conservatives themselves.
But you had these wicked whispers, you'll remember, from both people on the Tory side, like Greg Hands and Labour, people saying, well, Nick Clegg could have been a Conservative if he hadn't gone headbanging on Europe. I mean, but then you described your way into politics as a reaction against Thatcherism.
Yeah, I genuinely don't know what Greg Hands either thought or said at the time, but no, there was never any question of me being anything. And of course, at that time, maybe I get the chronology wrong, but you know, Paddy made a. He's not here, is he? The one thing you mustn't do with Paddy is inflate his ego even more in his presence. So can you please, all in the privacy of this room, promise me you don't tell him that I've said this now? He'd just be insufferable if that was the case. But he was a huge inspiration to me, and I remember, and I may have got the chronology wrong, but I remember when Paddy took a stand, again on a very obscure issue, you know, the passport holder, you know, Hong Kong residents having passports. It just spoke to me because it was generous. And it was different to what the other parties said, and it was internationalist, and it was not wildly popular with the tabloids at the time. So anyway, for all of those reasons, yes. There was no question of me being anything other than a Liberal Democrat.
Let's quite quickly, because this is well-rehearsed territory, both Clegg mania and the Clegg crash, both of which happened.
Let's dwell on the mania bit.
Okay, let's talk about the mania. I mean, the first time I thought, my gosh, he's gone up a notch in public profile with the phrase "no more than 30," which was a kind of moment in the spotlight, like I imagine you never experienced before. Then within a year or two of that, where you'd gone from someone who almost no one would have known who you were, I know you were the shadow Home Secretary, but that's not a household name, is it? And then, like, you were acing those TV debates, you were bouncing ahead of Labour briefly in the polls, and I wanted to ask you, did you ever think, with politics being fluid, that you could have come out first in that election? People were starting to speculate on it.
No, I didn't actually. I mean, whilst I think we were all sort of disappointed by the result on the night itself in 2010, because, as you say, there's been so much sort of hype. The opinion polls have been sort of very kind of bubbly and frothy and so on, and it was a real disappointment that all of that amounted to actually, I think, a net very small loss of seats from whatever it was. So whilst I was disappointed on the night, I never remotely expected that the kind of the exuberance and hype. No, I kind of think it's just generally the case actually in politics. You've got to try and keep a level head. You get these wild mood swings, particularly amplified in the press, both the written press and the obviously not Prospect, which is always level-headed, always wise, and always sees the wood for the trees. But you just get these mood swings. People talk themselves up into either a kind of hysterical negativity about people in parties, or hysterical adulation of them, and it's never either as extremely bad or as extremely good as it suggested at the time. So no, I didn't actually remotely think that we could just in one bound sort of demolish the duopoly of British politics overnight. But having said that, so in other words, whilst I think I was quite sort of sober in my kind of expectations, and actually even though I hope this doesn't sound like wisdom with hindsight, because I didn't really feel it at the time. I remember thinking at the time, oh God, the expectations of what we can do are just so obviously running well ahead of what we can do. It's always like that in life, and excess of expectations is a very dangerous thing in politics, because politics, as we of course subsequently found out, is a sort of, you're painting in shades of grey rather than great sort of vivid colours sometimes when you're governing. You have the sort of poetry of campaigning, and the prose are governing, and they're very different. And people who want to believe in poetry get a bit disappointed when they're delivered with prose. So I was disappointed at the actual outcome in terms of seats, but I never expected the Earth.
It's my duty to move on to the Clegg crash, which I promise you I'm going to do very briefly indeed. Let's not talk about tuition fees. Safe to say, when did you first come across the internet hit "I'm sorry" and what did you make of it?
Well, they asked me, the people who made the video, they asked me whether, because I think they had to seek permission to put my beautiful words to that irritatingly memorable tune. That's so irritatingly memorable, I remember one of my children started singing it as I was loading up my supermarket basket with stuff, and I sort of shoved a gobstopper in it to stop him. Suddenly he was allowed to have every sweet he wanted as long as he shut it up. No, so they asked me, and I said, yeah, I said, of course, you can hardly say no to that. As long as, I said, any revenues from the song were given over as they were. I think they got quite a healthy donation to the Sheffield Children's Hospital, which I've been very happy over the years, very associated with. No, so I was incredibly clever how quickly they do this.
The thing I wanted to just drill down in a bit more detail about is the coalition. You know, what went right, what went wrong, what you do again, and what you wouldn't. Like, I know there was a slightly symbolic effort, like we're talking to both sides, but the arithmetic meant there wasn't going to be an enduring coalition with Labour. It had nothing to do with your preferences, just the fact Labour was 80 odd seats behind or whatever they were. And I think you only had two options, didn't you? One of which was to go for the coalition you went for, or the other thing, which is paying dividends for the DUP at the moment, is to, you know, do a lot of brinkmanship and extract things policy by policy. And they've got money and they might get other things. But you went very quickly for the full coalition, bringing Liberals into the government for the first time since the war. Why did you do that? Because there was another way if you wanted it.
I don't think there is. Well, maybe other people disagree. I mean, we talked about this extensively in the endless meetings we had as a parliamentary party. Many of them I vaguely remember always being held in the middle of the night for some reason. These endless nocturnal meetings. It wasn't a sort of capricious decision taken by me or a couple of other people. This was a very kind of. We talked about it a lot collectively, and I first what the DUP has done is just a sort of they've just been given a bun. That wouldn't remotely apply to us. What, so the Lib Dems demand £1 billion to spend on itself? It's so grubby and it's so tawdry, and I just don't think we'd ever do that. And anyway, the country was, I think people's memories are often quite short. I remember vividly that the general election happened on the Thursday. That weekend, our television screens were, do you remember this, were full of demonstrations with sort of vehicles set on fire and violent protests in Greece because the latest Eurozone crisis. We were carrying as a country, as everyone knows, the largest peacetime deficit we'd ever had. There was clear sabre rattling from the bond markets that we were going to do next domino to fall. There was Alistair Darling, I remember, flew, even though Labour was not in power, on the Sunday, unprecedented for European finance ministers to meet on Sunday, flew to an emergency meeting in Brussels on the Sunday in a desperate attempt to try and stop a complete rout of the European markets on the Monday morning. There was a real sense we were teetering on the edge, which in many respects we were. We had a banking system which had completely imploded and was far larger as a proportion of our kind of national economic strength than any other economy in Europe. I mean, I sometimes people forget quite what a perilous position we're in. I remember shortly after I'd gone into government, a expressionless Treasury official saying to me, Deputy Prime Minister, you do realise that the full toxic liabilities of the British banking system now amount to 5 times the size of the whole British economy. And there was a silence, and sort of blood drained from my face as I realised that we had to sort of diffuse this bomb we were sitting on financially, which was much worse than the crisis which brought the IMF to rescue our country in the early 1970s. So in those circumstances, say all we want is £1 billion and then we'll decide what we do next week. Would have been wrong, would have been grubby, and wouldn't have put the country first. And also, by the way, just at a pure political level, I kind of think if you're going to get into power, which obviously is a heavy responsibility, and indeed a politically perilous thing to do, as we found out, surely you want to do it properly. You want to take power and actually wield power, not sort of give someone else power and sort of pretend that you've got nothing to do with it. By the way, I think we had done, we would have been condemned for all the bad stuff just as much as we were in government. We would have been able to do all the good stuff. So I just don't think it stands up to scrutiny.
Principal point you make about the point of being in politics is to be in power. But I think a lot of voters now, particularly, but going back, Liberal Democrat supporters as well, sometimes are more interested in protest than in taking power. There's always a chunk of the electorate that's more interested in letting off steam than anything else. And you really, by going in, you knew you were going to lose that chunk of the electorate.
Of course. But I mean, it's just so obvious. I mean, for those people who only ever want to support parties which will never ever do anything, well, fine. But that's not my kind of point, and I don't understand the point of being in a party. Be in a think tank or an academic, of course, probably some academics in the audience. I mean, it's not that. Or a single issue campaign. But party politics is the marriage of values and high ideals with the practice of trying to improve things for your fellow citizens, and you can't do that unless you're prepared to get your hands dirty. Now, of course, you're right. There were a number of voters certainly in the run-up to 2010, as I suspect, by the way, quite a lot of them now are voting for Corbyn, who just don't like the idea of being associated with anyone who is in power. But then don't get involved in party politics, because it is not a sect. It's not a sort of pure. We don't inhabit sort of pure caves in the mountains somewhere where we only breathe the pure mountain air and are never sullied by reality. Politics is the marriage of high ideals and difficult reality, and if you shirk away from that, then I think you actually do a disservice to those values and high ideals, because then all they then remain are sort of husks of an idea without actually making difference. And that's not the reason I went into politics. I went into politics not just to talk, but also to do stuff.
And so let's just turn then to the big haggle over the initial haggle over the coalition programme, the things you were going to do. Lots of it, of course, will be forgotten now. Lots of it was overwhelmed by events. A caricature of it might be to say the Conservatives got economic policy, they got deeper cuts than your manifesto was proposing, and in return you got a very worthwhile pupil premium. You got a referendum, although a referendum on a voting system that wasn't really the voting system you wanted. And you got an increase in the tax allowance, which I wonder if the Conservatives were that resistant to that, in that they continued to raise the tax allowance after they'd left the government with you. And important though the pupil premium is, I just wondered how that balance sheet stacks up.
Well, you're going to find me a bit prickly here. The idea that in 5 years of government, all we did was the pupil premium and raise the tax allowance on a referendum is a ludicrous caricature of what we did. From Steve Webb's single-handed overhaul of our pension system to Vince's amazing work on apprenticeships and industrial strategy, from what Ed Davey and Chris Hume did on completely overhauling the electricity market and eliciting the greatest investment in renewable energies that this country's ever seen, to our defence of civil liberties, to our ability to actually shield the country from the Conservatives' obsessions about the Eurozone, to free school meals to little toddlers, to a massive expansion of funding for those kids, not just through the pupil premium, but other means as well, who need the greatest help. This was a genuinely transformative programme of government. I'll give you a nice little example. I remember saying in a meeting with David Cameron and George Osborne that I wanted us to implement a small levy on disposable plastic bags. And they were absolutely ballistic. Absolutely no, George Osborne, no, it's a terrible tax, can't do that, and so on and so forth. Even, we had the spectacularly weird sight of Owen Paterson, who was the Secretary of State for something at the time, saying that he would only agree to us doing this if there was an exemption for fully biodegradable plastic bags that don't currently exist at all. I said, yeah, fine. Just another little example of a daily thing that happened only because of it. I can't control the fact that this weird guy who edits the Daily Mail, Paul Dacre, thinks that it's his achievement. We don't know anything to do with him. I would sort of urge you not to see it through such a narrow prism. If you look at the coalition agreement in 2010, I think some academics did this. We had far more of our manifesto in that final agreement than the Conservatives did. On the crucial issue of fiscal policy, I of course will never ever suggest that every cut that we introduced, every saving that we introduced, sit easy with my conscience. Of course not. Guess what? Saving money is a really difficult and unpopular thing to do. But firstly, our total fiscal contractions, they're called savings and cuts, were less than advocated by Gordon Brown and Alistair Darling in 2010. And why is that? Why is it less? Because of us. I vividly remember Danny, Alexander, myself, George Osborne, David Cameron, sitting around the room, and George Osborne and Nick Clegg, the Permanent Secretary of the Treasury, said, oh, we're not meeting our deficit reduction targets, we've got to add, I forget what it was, £13 billion of extra cuts if we're going to meet our deadline, which of course slipped and slipped and slipped. Yeah. And I said, absolutely not on your Nelly. If it's going to take us longer to make those savings, it'll just take us longer. But we're not going to simply keep chasing our tail. What did they do since 2015? They then went far, far further than anything, including this, I think, totally unacceptable additional £12 billion worth of welfare cuts, which incidentally is the reason why austerity is now so much more aggressive than it was between 2010 and 2015. So I think, of course I would say this, other people will disagree, that the caricature of a government which actually saved less than the Labour Party advocated at the time, actually saved much, much less, the fiscal contraction was much less than most other European countries, and then introduced really big progressive reforms on pensions, on education, on tax, on civil liberties. To reduce it to simply, well, you were thrown like like a dog receives a bone in a referendum which you then screwed up, and you then had to pay in blood with austerity, I think is a really, really misleading caricature.
I know you did do many other things in government, and I remember in particular that you fought very hard to keep the benefits going up with inflation near the beginning, and I know that was hard fought, but were you surprised by how difficult it was to get any credit for that? I remember that was a row over a couple of £billion or something in the Financial Times, in a small editorial in the Guardian I wrote. I don't think it was mentioned anywhere else at all.
No, I mean, it was actually a very big thing, because inflation at the time, I'm not sure if you remember, was in 2011, I think there was suddenly spiked to 5%. So inflation suddenly spiked. And I remember having a right old row around the cabinet table where Osborne wanted to decouple the indexation of welfare benefits, and we insisted that they remain. Now that was of huge benefit to many, many vulnerable people. Now, firstly, of course, no one hears of a policy that hasn't changed but could have been changed. And that of course, is one of the great dilemmas we have in government, is that we had to invest so much energy in stopping bad stuff happening that of course no one hears about. Because if the net result is that things just carry on as they were before, why should people feel, in a sense, any gratitude for that? But secondly, there was a political problem, which was that I totally understand why they did this, but the Labour Party, having been in government for 13 years, having actually presided over many, many deeply regressive things, far more aggressive than we would have allowed, and of course the Iraq War and many other things, they just loved being in opposition suddenly in 2010, and found, of course, that the easiest thing was just to sort of demonise any idea of having to save money. And you've still got it now today. It's what's created Corbyn. Because if you spend 5 years demonising austerity as some sort of evil choice, then of course you can never digest the idea that sometimes you need to work out as a country a way of kind of living within the means of what you can afford. So what we had was not only, of course, the vituperation from the right, who intensely disliked the way we were acting as a restraint on the Conservatives. You also had this endless vituperation on the left, where we could be easily caricatured, and I could understand, and we were in breathless, almost loopy terms, a sort of turncoat, Judas Iscariot, lost our soul, all the rest of it. And so you got this in stereo. And as I've said many times before, when Polly Toynbee and Paul Dacre basically shout at you in equal volume, if from ideologically opposed ends of the spectrum, it has an effect over 5 years. Of course it does. And that's one of the many reasons why every time we did do big progressive things, it was very, very difficult to get any echo chambers to recognise that.
No, I can see that. I wonder though, let's talk about the Tories and the way you handled them, how difficult they were to deal with. Because there was a point, and I know you'd have thought you had to show the coalition could work in a sceptical country, where you say, you said something like, they talk about the big society, and it's another term for what we call the liberal society. When I heard that, I kind of thought, and I was completely wrong about this, I thought, he's getting ready to be like the National Liberals or the Liberal Unionists and merge. And of course, it wasn't like that at all. But looking back, do you think rhetorically, after the Rose Garden for a year or two, you just got too close?
No, actually, we got much less close than people think. I totally accept the images and photos and live on, because it was a sunny day and there was a laugh and so on. It sort of, had this sort of misplaced idea of some sort of bromance. It wasn't at all. It's actually quite a hard-headed transaction from the outset. But it's interesting you mention that, because, of course, again, it's only a few years ago, but things have changed so dramatically. When Cameron first burst onto the scene, and when he sort of ran that first election campaign, and then we formed the coalition, of course, one of the reasons we thought that strategically it was a sustainable thing to do was that he had made his whole political career on the premise that he was changing the Conservative Party from being a party that banged on about law and order, immigration, and Europe, to a centrist party more worried about the environment, about errant hoodies, his whole thing was I am a new sort of compassionate Conservative. And so it wasn't a surprise that I thought, that many people thought, of course we're not in any way identical, but you can do business with these people, because these people are not being hijacked by their own prejudices. What happened over the 5 years is this extraordinary shift by David Cameron, being yanked ever more firmly to the kind of right-wing corner of his party. And he ended up talking about green crap, ended up obviously promising a European referendum, ended up indulging the most ludicrous kind of gimmicks around immigration, illegal immigration, and so on and so forth. So I think in many ways what was very difficult for us, and I remember saying once to Cameron Osborne, I said, look, we went into government with a party, with you guys, when you told us you were kind of moderate sort of internationalist conservatives. And now you've kind of turned into this kind of, it was like being in a sort of cage with a demented gorilla, which was just constantly thrashing around, constantly trying to find new ways of satisfying, Jacob Rees-Mogg and Paul Dacre and all these kind of loopy people. And that's what, and in my view, of course, lots of imperfect things, made mistakes, of course, but actually, broadly speaking, I think you have to be a very, very partisan and fairly unfair observer to somehow suggest that the Liberal Democrats didn't cleave to the kind of moderate liberal centre in those 5 years, where we were in government with a much larger party, which also had much greater bandwidth in the media, that lurched back to type.
Yeah.
And that's the tragedy for Cameron, which was that the great tragedy for Cameron is that his initial instincts were right, and he ended up not being able, he was just not in command of his own party by the end. And that made the coalition as kind of scratchy as it was by the end. Because there was no meeting point between us and a sort of Jacob Rees-Mogg Tory party, of course not.
And on the Constitution, you came in a year after the expenses crisis. It was a real moment where we thought the Constitution might change. You mentioned AV, we didn't get that. House of Lords, you were passionate about getting elected, and I know it's a real regret of yours that didn't happen. And then even the fixed-term parliaments have now been short-circuited. And I know there's some other things around recall of dodgy MPs and stuff, but it's small stuff. And I just wondered, do you think the real problem with the way that this didn't happen, is it about Britain just being a country that can't reform its constitution, or is it just the Tories' fault?
Oh, no, it's not the Tories' fault, it's Tories and Labour. That's a complete... no, seriously, it's a really important... Really important to remember this. It's really important to remember this. I'm, oddly enough, more angry with Labour's failure to deliver its progressive commitment to electoral You expect that from the Tories. You expect that from the Tories. And on all three issues, I remember on the AV referendum, which of course, with hindsight, was badly timed in the spring of 2011. It was in the wake of the comprehensive spending round, tuition fees and so on and so forth. Ed Miliband had a choice. He could either have actually really put his shoulders to the wheel and try and mobilise Labour voters, Labour supporters and Labour supporting newspapers to advocate AV, which, let's remember, was their policy. One of the reasons we put AV on the ballot paper is if we put our policy, STV, it would be completely friendless. We would have had absolutely no chance of getting it whatsoever. So we thought, well, at least put on the ballot paper Labour's preferred option. They'd actually vote, they actually campaign for it. I think he gave one speech, and then they just let us kind of, in a sense, spin in the wind. House of Lords reform, exactly the same. It was the Labour Party that finally skewered it on some specious timetable vote, and I remember vividly, poor David Laws, I asked him to spend months and months and months talking to representatives of the Labour and the Conservative parties about party funding reform. It was a classic establishment stitcher. Neither the trade union bosses nor the treasurer of the Conservative Party had any intention of doing anything about the rotten way in which those parties are funded. So, look, what is my lesson? My lesson is, if you want to change the fundamental way in which money and votes and power is administered and circulated in the British political system, you have to get one of the two larger vested interests over a barrel. Absolutely over a barrel. So if there's any naivety, it's probably that if we ever do this again, if any of my successors do this again, you just have to get a promise written in blood from either the Labour or the Conservative Party. They'll go ahead with these reforms. Otherwise, they will use every specious reason in the book to wriggle out of it.
Just a final word on kind of colleagues. I've heard it said that it became impossible to mention the name Michael Gove in your company by the end of the coalition. Was he the most difficult one for you, or were there lots of them who just, you couldn't get on with by the end?
No, I mean, look, like we all are, I'm a deeply sort of flawed human being, but I was always very mindful, without being sort of pompous about it, I was very mindful that I had a big duty, and the duty was to try and play my role in leading a good government, broadly doing, good things in very, very difficult circumstances. And so I tried not to let the kind of personal, kind of sully the politics too much. But it's an open secret. I did say to one point at David, I said, I really can't deal with this man anymore. Yeah. So, poor David Laws sort of ended up sort of acting as a sort of almost intermediary on my behalf. Yes, on one occasion, famously, found Michael Gove locking himself in the loo because he didn't want to talk to David. So it did.
At least there two-way traffic.
It did. Yes, that's quite a yeah. So it did reach slightly peculiar heights, but. No, but on the whole,
I mean, do you keep up with any of them now?
Not Michael Gove, I sort of see them. I was never sort of socially.
No.
But I've seen Osborne, I've seen Cameron, I've seen Philip Hammond. But not in any sort of particularly intense or lovey-dovey way.
On the values that took you in the first place, the liberal values, the liberal tradition of concern with civil liberties, which I think even Lib Dem baiters with any civil libertarian bones in their body noticed quite quickly once the Tories came out with the majority. But do you think Britain came out of this period of partial liberal government a more liberal place? Got rid of ID cards, but on the other hand, secret courts and immigration go-home vans. How do you see it on that core liberal territory?
On civil liberties?
Yeah, are we better placed than we were 7 years ago, or not?
I think we are. Well, not now, but not least because of the legislation which the Conservatives have rushed onto the statute book since, notably what was called or branded the Snoopers Charter, which is by far the most significant legislative incursion into the kind of balance between security and privacy and information held on citizens and by the state. I think, look, there's a debate which people will just infinitely agree or disagree about, this issue of whether it serves justice or not to have justice in courts, which are not open to the public, and the alternative, by the way, being not open justice but no justice at all. So there was just a very difficult, and we as a party language talked about this, and the party collectively decided that some years ago that it was the wrong step. I remain of the view that in an imperfect world the alternative was no administration of justice at all, which I don't feel. Still don't feel entirely comfortable with as an alternative. I think on most other things, I think we upheld the kind of civil libertarian tradition pretty forcefully.
And just what about whether there's going to be another coalition? You wanted to change the style of politics, but you also welcome the kind of more continental deal between different parties rather than pretending one party could do everything. But then came the deluge in 2015. Do you think it's likely now that there could be another coalition anytime soon?
I think it's not only likely, I think it's highly, highly probable that there will come a time at some point where no party has won an absolute majority. Yes, I don't believe for a minute.
It's already happened, actually.
Yeah, indeed. And I don't believe for a minute that the sort of clock has been turned back to the 1950s and everyone's either in the red or blue corner and so on and so forth. We're obviously going through quite a sort of pendulum swing and now away from the Conservatives. Obviously, Corbyn's got the sort of zeitgeist in sort of the appetite for change in many respects. But I think the sort of underlying features of fracturing in politics are still there. There's huge fracturing between the generations, between the young and the old. People now no longer vote in that kind of tribal way handed down one generation to the next. We've become much more consumerist about our politics. Social media has made it a much more volatile thing. So I think the volatility of politics, the collapse of old class-based tribal affiliations, the kind of just sheer fluidity of the world we live in, means that you will get, perhaps repeatedly, parliaments where no party wins outright. And my own view is that the experience of the Liberal Democrats in the ballot box in 2015, I think it would be a tragedy if the political class concluded from that therefore politicians should never seek to govern together across party lines. I think that would be a very cowardly thing to do, because I remain of the view it was exactly the right thing for the country at the time, certainly compared to the absolute farce that we've had since the spring of 2015. And also because, look, we have a political system, I mean, constitutionally, the way that votes are administered. We have a parliament, literally the way it's architecturally organised. We have a media climate, which you know better than I do, which all lends towards this sort of disfiguring polarisation of politics. This almost ludicrous, infantile stereotyping of politicians, as beastly or beautiful, as evil or good, all the rest of it. I just remain of the view that if you want to do good things in politics, and if no one wins outright, there is nothing wrong with, as long as you hold on to your values and your principles, there's actually nothing wrong with saying in a grown-up way that you have to share power with others. And as I say, I think it would be both a misreading of kind of what happened in the run-up to 2015, and certainly a disservice to future generations if from now on all politicians were just to sort of retreat to their corners and say, oh no, we're never going to touch that live wire of cooperative politics evermore because it's damaging to us. That way is the politics of sort of small changes and bitter recrimination.
Faced with a world where there might be quite a lot of small politics and bitter recrimination as you see it, and Trump, Tony Blair said, in a world of Trump, Brexit and Corbyn, none of which he likes, he doesn't feel he quite understands politics anymore in the way that he used to feel absolutely confident that he did. And I wondered, is that a sentiment you share when you look over these last couple of years? Obviously you've got lots of disagreements with Blair, but on that kind of reading of it.
No, I totally understand why millions of people in our country, the United States and elsewhere, partly for a combination of long-term reasons. I just think there have been things which have been going on in our economy, in our labour market, which has instilled over a long period, it's not the responsibility of one politician or one government, which have instilled a creeping sense of insecurity in the way people hold work. I think there's been a compression on people's take-home pay, which started well before 2008, partly because of the way in which labour markets were liberalised and so on and so forth, which then was given a massive kind of electric shock in 2008 in the following sense. We avoided in our country mass unemployment by way of millions of our fellow citizens accepting less money for the same hours of work done. And I just think it is impossible to exaggerate how those long-term changes in our economy, plus other things, social media, the collapse of the Cold War, so the end of the sort of ideological scaffolding, the kind of right-left scaffolding that I grew up with, and many of us grew up with. But I think it's impossible to exaggerate how 2008 still is the real, you can't understand Trump or Brexit. You can't understand Corbyn, I think, without understanding quite how profound 2008 has been in the damage it's done to our social fabric. If you have millions of people who work the same hours for less pay, or more hours for the same pay, for 8-9 years, I mean, that's the longest period of constraint on people's take-home pay since records began. And it's not their fault. It's the bankers, it's the regulators, it's the politicians. I totally understand why then Trump comes along and says, to hell with it, I'm going to build a wall and all will be well. And Farage comes along and says, to hell with it, all will be well. And we're going to just get out of the European Union. And Keir Wilders said, to hell, all will be well with it. You just have to blame Islam. And Le Pen says, to hell with it, all will be well, you just blame immigrants. And Viktor Orban does it in Hungary. And Podemos does it in Spain. I totally understand why post-2008, the beguiling, seductive voice of populists, principally from the right, but from the left as well, do as well as they do. And so my own view is one of the things that we need to do as a party is we just need to be much, much more tough on ourselves, to ask ourselves whether we've got the right questions for those underlying pressures on people's everyday sense of security and well-being.
And do you think, a lot of us would have said there's a massive gap in the Senate ground going into 2017 election. Liberal Democrats got a few great local results. Nationwide, they were nowhere really, same results, 2015, 7%. Do you think that's because you hadn't got the right policies as a party, you haven't developed them yet?
I'm quite reluctant to sort of start, going over what happened in I'm going to talk about what happened in Sheffield Hallam, which was terrible. Things swirled around a lot in the election campaign itself. And actually, in many ways, I can kind of understand when... I remember vividly the moment that the Labour Party's manifesto was leaked. I don't quite know whether it was deliberate or not. And it was this leak of sort of... it was sort of an invitation to the British people to have a warm bath and a nice cup of tea. We don't have to take any more decisions. We can spend money, lots of money to make for everybody. All will be well. We can wish all these ghastly, difficult sort of decisions away. I can totally understand why a very weary electorate, after years of kind of tough news, just sort of breathe, at last. I can totally get that. So I can see why the Labour Party, perhaps much to its own surprise as anything else, became the vehicle for kind of the change message. And maybe in that context, us talking about another vote in another set of circumstances about an issue which had recently divided opinion might have just seemed less kind of beguiling emotion. I can see all of those things, but that doesn't mean that the platform which we stood was the wrong one in the long run.
Let's turn to Brexit. You've got a book coming out in about 2 weeks, isn't it? Is that right?
October 12th.
3 weeks.
Available, very affordable, good price in all retail outlets. It's called How to Stop Brexit and Make Britain Great Again.
There you go. You've got a little Road to Remain flowchart in the new prospectus. There's a lot of interest beyond the party in whether it is really stoppable. Do you think it might be?
I don't think you can reopen the issue of Brexit in any scenario unless MPs across parties are prepared to say no to the deal, half-baked deal, or whatever it is that Theresa May presents to them next October. So I think the sort of major moment will be in the autumn of next year, almost exactly a year from now. Theresa May has said she'll put before Parliament then a vote on whatever she's been able to sort of scrape together in these talks. And if at that point MPs say, well, hang on a minute, this doesn't remotely measure up to what my constituents were promised. Because remember, lots of people, and it's really important, it's very important not to berate people for voting for Brexit just because we disagree with them. Lots and lots of people voted for Brexit in ways which I consider to be totally understandable, given what they were promised they would get. Famously, obviously, 350 million quid for the NHS, a cornucopia of new trade deals, apparently, which would more than outweigh the trade we already do with the European Union, complete control over our borders, total freedom of any judgments from European judges, the exact same benefits, according to David Davis, out of the single markets we have inside it. And in a sense, we might disagree, why would you not vote for that? And I think the key thing is, it's really important now to let the government get on with trying to show the British people that it can deliver any of that. Now, I don't believe a single one of those main commitments made to the British people will remotely be included in whatever Theresa May puts before the Parliament next October. So it's very important, and that's what my book is about, to place pressure on Labour and Conservative MPs in particular to at that point say, hang on a minute, both of us Remain voting or Brexit voting MPs, what my constituents were promised is completely different to what you're offering up today, and on that basis, I'm not going to give it my consent, which I think would not only would be a sensible choice for Parliament, I actually think it would be a democratic duty for Parliament at that point to say, no, hang on, up with that we will not put. Now then, of course, you'll have a crisis, you'll have a gridlock and so on, but at that point, it seems to me we can reopen it and revisit how the United Kingdom, and if the United Kingdom can be stitched back together into the European family. My own view is that we shouldn't imagine, as a pro-European party, that you can simply turn the clock back to the 22nd of June 2016. I'm afraid you just can't in life, certainly not in politics. I mean, the European Union has moved on, much more than many people, I think, appreciate. They've moved on. In many ways, the European Union is no longer, in many important respects, it's not like it was on the 22nd of June 2016. I nonetheless think it would be possible, with ingenuity and generosity, for the United Kingdom to re-enter, if I can put it like that, the European Union, at a time when the European Union itself is moving towards a new kind of union of concentric circles, in which Macron and Merkel will preside over a more sort of federalised centre, organised around the Eurozone. Central Eastern European countries will be in a slightly outer ring, and it seems to me we could find a more comfortable place in an outer ring as well, still part of the core institutions of the single market, the customs union and so on, but disassociated from it in other respects. So that's my view, that's the reason I wrote the book. But nothing can be done. You can't put Humpty Dumpty back together again, you can't salvage anything from this train crash unless MPs across parties are brave enough to say, and in the heart of hearts, many of them will know this, will say to Theresa May, sorry, what you've got here is a complete betrayal of what Brexiteers promised to the people in the summer of 2016.
So if I've got you right, I just got slightly nervous, because I think there'll be enough people here who are also nerdishly interested in this pinch point in a year's time. You vote down the presumably inadequate deal that David Davis and co come back with. That's your crisis moment, because then the choice clarifies as over the cliff edge, ruin the economy, or like stop and rethink.
But it's very important for those who, yes, it is a nerdy question, but it's a good one. So Theresa May, in order to sort of, in a sense, hold a gun to MPs' heads, has said, I'm sure you're aware of this, has said, all I'm going to offer you a vote on in October is either whatever meagre gruel I come up with, or chaos. But it's a completely false threat, because she can't impose chaos in October of next year, because we don't legally run out of road until March 2019, which is, in my view, why it's so important to bring this to a head at that crucial point after the government has been given enough time to come up with something, but before we legally leave. Now, I know there are other people in the kind of pro-European camp who say, that's not going to work, we've got to basically leave first and then reapply later and so on. I suppose so, but I think it'd be much, much better to bring this to a head when we know what we're being offered. And I can't think of any more impeccably democratic basis upon which you refuse this, by literally comparing what people were told they would get with what they won't get in that deal. One of the reasons I wrote this book is partly to explain that, and I go into some detail about what I think we can all do to put pressure, particularly on Conservative and Labour MPs, and also to sketch out how the European Union, as it is changing, could kind of help to realign the United Kingdom into the European Union. So you just have to wait to read it. It'll be a page turn for all of you. But there's something more fundamental, which is that the Brexiteers have been incredibly effective in giving the impression that the 23rd of June 2016 was like a sort of biblical moment, and that we can't ever remotely revisit it. That was sort of chiselled in stone, and we have no right to think again. But a democracy which doesn't think again is not a democracy. I mean, in a free country, thing to be told in a democracy, a mature democracy, thou shalt never raise question marks about a decision you've taken on a false prospectus. And that's why I think it's really important, beyond everything else, for the quality of our democracy to assert our right, dare I say it, to take back control, and to take back control of our democracy.
So the May platform kind of falls to pieces with this vote, and then presumably you go to Europe and say, we'll have a bit more time, and then all the other stuff about concentric circles of Europe or whatever you're talking about, by getting the clock stopped, you then open the wider discussion. Is that roughly right? Yeah, the
clock stop is a good. I do think you'd need to sort of push the pause button, and of course then you get people saying, no, but sort of Article 50 is a clock which has already been set off and it can't be. So it's complete nonsense. I remember when I worked in the European Union for 10 years, there was this almost magical capacity for European negotiators to stop the clock. Time suddenly became something you could sort of switch on and off. I mean, there is an international trade agreement I'm aware of in the last 20 years, which hasn't gone well beyond what was initially deemed to be its absolutely sort of hard and fast a deadline. So if the European Union felt that the UK, might be kind of wishing to revisit this, I'm absolutely sure that they would try their damnedest to give us the space to do it. They're not going to be infinitely patient. We'd probably have to pay a diplomatic price. As I said before, I'm not sure if it would be possible to recreate all the exemptions and carve-outs and special treatments and rebates and all the rest of it that we've been granted over the last 40 years, which we enjoyed until now. But I certainly think that strategically for the European Union, and certainly the leaders I've spoken to, they remain of the view that a European Union with the United Kingdom in it, however bolshevik in it, is better than a European Union with a country the size of the United Kingdom. Remember that the size of our economy is equivalent to 17 of the 27 remaining member states. So it's a hugely disruptive thing. Obviously more disruptive to us, but disruptive to them as well. So I think it could be done. I'm not saying it will certainly be done. I think it could be done. It requires a bit more imagination, but it requires, first and foremost, a belief in people's hearts that we are free to change our mind if circumstances change. Why else do we hold elections every few years? John Maynard Keynes famously said it. What is it? When the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do? This depriving us of the liberty to revisit something when it hasn't turned out remotely as it was supposed to seems to me to be a very profound deprivation of our liberty in a liberal democracy.
I'm just going to ask two more questions, and then I'm going to give the audience a chance to come in. The first one is just around sort of 2014, there was a lot of stuff in the press saying, I think the phrase was, there's no red line against having this referendum as far as the Liberal Democrats were concerned. And it made sense in a way, because back in the distant past, 2005, I think the Liberal Democrats had talked about an in-out referendum when Tony Blair promised one and then wriggled out of it. Was it a red line? If if you'd been back, you know, and you'd held on in 15 more seats and Cameron had needed another coalition, would there have been a referendum at all?
No, not under my leadership. I don't know where that tittle-tattle came from. For me, there was absolutely no way at all that I ever would have connived or consented to a referendum purely designed to settle an internal dispute within the Conservative Party. You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. We didn't have that as a party sort of fatwa against the idea of referendum. Of course not. Of course not. And we have always been consistent that where the United Kingdom has been asked to relinquish or pool new powers in the European Union by way of a new treaty, that is, you know, that's a reasonable basis on which to ask the British people whether they consent to that. But to reopen the whole thing, just on the whimsical basis that, you know, David Cameron thinks it's a neat way to kind of quell the dispute within his own party. That's something I never. I think David Laws has written about this. I remember vividly it was about a week before the general election in 2015, that David Laws, Danny Alexander and I met, and we obviously knew then it was going to be a very, very tough result. We didn't remotely think it was going to be as bad as it turned out to be. And I remember Danny and David saying to me, you know, we need to think about, if we do have to negotiate with the Conservatives, obviously their number one demand will be a referendum. You know, do we want to think about kind of things that we might want to demand in return? You know, maybe the Liberal Democrats should be Vince Cable should be Chancellor of the Exchequer, or we should change this on economic policy, or that, this, that, and the other, or have an electoral reform, you know, with no strings attached overnight. And I remember vividly saying to them, you know, just over my dead body, I couldn't do it. I couldn't, partly because I feel about this very, you know, I always have done all my life. I just couldn't ever risk the idea that we would be an unwitting, if you like, accomplice in something which would jeopardise our place in the European Union. So I was, and Cameron knew that I thought that, because I think we had like one conversation where he, in that sort of very British way, he was sort of staring at me and said, yeah, well, I suppose you might have to think of what would happen if there's another hung parliament. Do you think, Nick, sort of pass the coffee, thing? And I sort of there, sort of, pass the sugar. No, I can't possibly do that because of your, you know, because of this sort of Europe thing. And I remember then Cameron saying that sort of regal wave the hand, sort of said, oh, it'll all be fine, you know, we'll all be on the same side, it'll be one, of course it'll be one. And of course that's the other thing, which this referendum wasn't only held to settle an internal dispute, it was held with a view that there was no risk of defeat, which is one of the reasons why, and I think we're all a little bit guilty of this perhaps, which is why there wasn't greater attention devoted in Parliament to giving 16 and 17-year-olds the vote, putting a sort of minimum requirement of what the majority should be and so on and so forth. Because I think everybody actually at that time kind of assumed, whether you were for or against the referendum, that the result was only going to go one way. So look, all these things are often accident after idiocy, after sort of coincidence, after, you know, accident. But I certainly, as far as I was speaking, no, it was something I would never have contemplated.
Brilliant. And I'd just like to ask a final question about you. You're a few months out of Parliament now, you're looking very well and relaxed, but you've had a tough time. You've been talking about your child being ill, and hopefully that's all on the mend. And I just wondered, because I'm sure a lot of people here who've come to you want to know what your plans are. Are you enjoying life only half in politics enough now to rule out a return? I guess the House of Lords is not a natural destination.
No.
Back to the Commons one day, or never?
No, well, House of Lords, no. I'm not a great fan of an unelected House of Lords, and I don't think an unelected House of Lords is a great fan of me either. So no, I wouldn't, not that it's been suggested, but no, I wouldn't want to go to the House of Lords. I mean, look, politics will always be in my blood. I will always speak out about the things that I care about. I'm lucky that on occasion when I sort of, you know, rant about Brexit, there are still people who want to listen to me, and I'll continue to do that. So it's not as if I'm sort of going to sort of vacate the public stage, if I can put it that way, on some of the debates I, you know, really care about. But I'm not itching to get back into, you know, I've been in elected politics for close to 20 years, and I'm very, very lucky. I'm 50 and in relatively, I think, sort of good health, and I've got this wonderful opportunity to kind of, you know, do other things. And whilst I'm passionate about politics, I've never been very obsessive about it, and there are, metaphorically, literally, other mountains to climb. So no, I'm going to try and do other stuff while still retaining a voice in some public public debates. And but no, of course you don't rule out forever. But no, I'm not straining at the bits to get back into the Commons.
Great. Now I'm sure people, we've got about 15-20 minutes, and I'm sure people will want to ask a question. Can I just ask you, Nick, would you rather take them grouped, or would you rather just do one at a time?
Up to you.
Right, I think we'll just do them one at a time, but they need to be really crisp and quick, because I want to get as many people in as possible.
You mentioned electoral reform and the coalition agreement, and you decided on an AV referendum. I wonder if you could talk through the details of why you decided it would be a referendum on AV, not without a referendum, and why STP was never thought to be an option. You've mentioned there's a turn against establishment politics during the coalition. Why are you so sure we can win a referendum on STP?
Good Lib Dem question.
So I'm afraid the distinctions between different forms of electoral reform are really lost on the public on the whole. I mean, you win this argument either in favour of change or not because the letters are different. They fascinate us. Of course, I think the STP is far superior to AV. The fundamental question is, are people dissatisfied enough with politics as it is, and with the system as it is, that they want change? I don't remotely think that if we had STV on the ballot paper, suddenly the result would have been dramatically different in the spring of 2009, and there's no evidence to suggest that is the case. The reason we had AV made a referendum was that is what we collectively agreed as a party would be the kind of condition of one of the conditions of our entry into the coalition. As I explained earlier, there was also the tactical argument that since we are never, the Liberal Democrats, going to win this argument on our own, there are such ferocious vested interests on both right and left who want to keep the status quo as it is. There's absolutely no way the Liberal Democrats, and with all the respect to Tom, an occasionally positive editorial in The Guardian, read by how many people? How many people read the editorial?
It depends. On a good day, 40,000.
40,000. When you're asking 66 million people. So, we've got to be very hard-headed. How do you win a referendum on a subject which people don't care about, where they don't, the people who count, where they don't make a distinction between one thing or other? Now, we thought as a party, that the anger about MPs' expenses, which again, memories are short, that was one of the most dominant things that coloured the election in 2010. It was the banking crisis in 2008, and it was MP, it was duck houses, and trouser presses, and all the rest of it. So the 2010 general election, which propelled us into power, was driven by two twin crises: a crisis in our economy and a crisis in our politics. And so we thought, not illogically, that would that this would be the kind of spark that would bring the dissatisfaction of politics to light, and if we could funnel it into a vote about the electoral system, where we could promise a kind of new, more accountable way of MPs behaving, that would resonate. What I don't think any of us remotely anticipated, I didn't, was that after the comprehensive spending round in the autumn of 2010, which was this huge jumbo announcement of all of these gory savings that we needed to make, and of course included in that great package the announcement about the change on higher education, I don't think any of us anticipated how quickly austerity and all of the controversies linked with it completely obliterated remaining public interest in political reform. It was the most dramatic thing I've experienced. It was as if almost overnight, much more pressing concerns about public services, and all that, and the NHS and schools.
Unemployment was speaking, wasn't it, as well?
Sorry?
We forget that unemployment was speaking.
So there was a profound sense of economic uncertainty. And it's a good lesson. You see this over and over again in British politics, that things that we quite rightly care about, civil liberties, electoral reform, dare I say even the environment, tend to peak in good times, and they absolutely plummet when visceral feelings of job insecurity or public service and things like that intrude. And that's what intruded in a big, big way and made it exceptionally difficult for us to get a hearing. So, I mean, look, the what if game is a wonderful board game, particularly at party conferences like this. But I do sometimes wonder what would have happened if we had deferred that referendum to the back end of the Parliament rather than the front end. I don't necessarily think we would have won it, but in an odd kind of way, I wonder whether we might actually have got a bit more of a hearing than we did at that point in spring of 2011.
The economic emergency. Now, just here, we've got, I don't know, please everyone keep your questions.
Thank you. Nick, if you were going to give one piece of advice to those us activists who are going to be carrying this on, taking the baton on, particularly around Brexit, but also to those of us who are undertaking this campaign while trying not to be a one-trick pony, and in areas where we have a very strong Leave vote, what would be your advice?
Well, I think the first thing, as I said earlier, is you could disagree with someone who's voted differently to you in the referendum without appearing to sort of dismiss them and their concerns. So, as I said earlier, I think it's really important to acknowledge that there are lots of Leave voters who voted for Brexit, however passionately we might disagree with them and their outcome, partly because what the blandishments that they were being sort of smothered with was so attractive. And I think you've got to sort of acknowledge that, and I think you've got to then move it on. And say, I understand why, in those circumstances, given all of the kind of the utopia you were promised, that it was, I don't agree, of course I don't agree, but I understand why people did. I think you then move it on to, but what's worrisome is that you're not getting anything of what you were promised. Nothing. And Boris Johnson has been immensely helpful in this sort of gargantuan rampage of his ego once again, in 4,000 words in the Daily Telegraph, and reminding us of this monumental lie that they emblazoned on the side. And by the way, the arrogance and the sort of disrespect to the British people that you think you can not only lie to them once, but that you can lie to them a second time. It's quite astonishing. I think you really need to sort of say, you need to make common cause with some of those, because look, the other thing to remember is there are people like, certainly me, who care passionately about this issue. I have done all my life, I always will do. There are other people who care passionately the other way, who think leaving the European Union is the most important thing. The vast majority of the British people don't care about it that much. Many of them were invited to vote when they actually were slightly uncomfortable that they were being asked to make it. So I'm sure you've had this on the doorstep. People saying, yeah, I don't know why I was being asked in the first place. And I've met people sort of saying, I didn't even actually know quite how I was going to vote until I went down to the polling station. And so for lots of people, it was and remains a rather sort of ambivalent issue. And they don't like being told that somehow they were stupid or how dare they have got it wrong. You need to sort of say, of course I understand, given all the things that you were promised by these jokers and these opportunists. You should blame it on the Goves, the Farages and Johnson, be as rude as you like about them, but not about the voters. And then I think the crucial thing is to link it to the things that we know people care about. Let me give you a very good example. It is impossible to restore funding to the public services we all care about and do Brexit in the way that they want. It is impossible. You have to choose. Because I think I'm right in saying that Philip Hammond, in the autumn statement, sort of fine print last autumn, has already booked, I think it's a £59 billion extra hole in the public finances, very conservatively in my view, I mean much worse than that, because of the effects of Brexit. And I suspect, by the way, look out for what he says in the next autumn statement, what the Office of Budget responds. In other words, we already know, on the government's own figures, that Brexit is going to be £59 billion less money for the NHS, less money for teachers, less money for social care. I just think you have to, make those links. First, through, dare I say, empathy with people who voted for Brexit, given what they were told at the time. And then secondly, make links to the things that the daily things that people care about, which just aren't going to be made considerably harder if we proceed with Brexit in the way that is envisaged. Does that make sense?
Brilliant. We've got one here, I think, at the back.
Thank you. Nick, you made a couple of comments that gave images that will stick with me for a long time. The first was your demented gorilla comment. Cameron, you couldn't control the extreme wing of his party. And you also...
Sorry, can you just walk this a bit further away?
Sorry about that. Yeah, you said about demented gorilla, about Cameron couldn't control the extreme wing of his party. And you also said that to get to electoral reform, you have to have one or the other parties over a barrel, and that was perhaps a piece of advice for the future. I was just wondering if, with the benefit of hindsight, you think that one of the reasons Cameron didn't need to worry about extreme with his party was because he believed and ultimately he could rely on you and the Liberal Democrats, and whether perhaps you could have been just a little bit harder and actually had him over a barrel at some later stage in the coalition.
I think on the referendum, the electoral reform issue, I mean, we in a sense, we included that in the coalition agreement, which I'm not sure if you were there, we all met, do you remember, for those of you who do remember, I know there are lots of new members, we all met, it's sort of North Korean style, in this great hangar, this aircraft hangar somewhere in Birmingham. We all put our hands up as one, well, almost as one, supporting the coalition agreement, which had this proviso, if you like, written into it. Look, my own view, but other people choose to interpret the same facts differently, is that we were extraordinarily tough and punched very, very well above our weight. The main tax policy of that government, some of the most progressive school education, early years education reforms, the huge overhaul in pensions, energy policy, industrial policy. I mean, all of these vast swathes of policy are basically written by the smaller party in the coalition. When I've compared notes with other smaller parties and other European coalitions, would you believe it? I wish sometimes people would both hear it and believe it. They marvel at how we punched above our weight. But the lesson, and I wrote about this in my best-selling book, which if you haven't read it, shame on you. The many, many lessons I learned the hard way is that you can slave away in the boiler room as much as you like, winning these battles, being tough, sitting around the cabinet table and thumping your fist and saying, I insist on this, or I insist on blocking that. If the public don't see you making those announcements, if you're not at the dispatch box, if you're not standing on the steps of number 10, your efforts are basically invisible. And you can't expect the public to guess at your good work if the how can I put it, if the kind of orchestration of power is such that you are sort of invisible to them. And I think, I've said this on other occasions, but the visual image of me sitting next to David Cameron in Prime Minister's Questions while he did the talking for the government, and I sat either looking a little bit glum or a little bit uncomfortable, but silent next to him, I think was a really damaging image. Because it allowed, particularly the left, to say, oh, you're just a puppet for the Tories, you're passive. And so one of my advice would be, actually almost more important than policy, was if we or anyone else does this again, make sure the way that power is visually expressed reflects the reality. And it's one of the things which, to be fair to the Tories, because they're a power-hungry lot, they understood better than we did, which was that it's not just getting the kind of the policy right, it's the way that it's translated visually.
Build another dispatch box a bit down the bench for the second coalition?
This might sound ridiculous. All of this is the past, and it's the dim and distant past. But
no, but you say coalition's necessary for the future. It's really important for this side.
So let me give you an example. I think, I can't remember what it was, it sounds slightly absurd that I spent any time on this, but because I became so mindful of that, that particularly for, with again, great respect, sort of Guardianista community, this image of, sort of passive, patsy Lib Dem sitting there quietly and letting beastly Tories do beastly things to us, because I could just feel how powerful that was. I just thought, well, is there a way that I could kind of move down the benches? I'm not sure. So you are David Cameron, man. And you're me. And I thought, could I move to you? Because there's a gangway there between the Conservative benches and the Lib Dem benches. So I thought, if I go there, so I'm not sitting next to him, I'm out of that camera shot, if you like, and then I do Deputy Prime Minister's Questions in my own sort of style behind the dispatch box. And so we actually spent a bit of time in my team saying, could I make this kind of sort of move? But by that stage, would you believe it, we decided that there would be such derision that if late in the Parliament, I somehow tried to sort of, make things better by moving. See, I think it's probably the right judgment. I think it was just too late. But anyway, so there you go. My great insight into British politics is that if anyone does what I do next time, sit somewhere else.
Supplementary, which is, would it have been a better look, which is what we're talking about, look more different, if instead of having this overarching shadowing for Cameron role, you'd been, say, Home Secretary. There certainly wouldn't have been the Immigrants Go Home vans, would there? But you'd have been able to pick departmental fights much more clearly.
Can I just, sorry, I'm sounding so quickly with it. It's very interesting you mentioned that. Go Home vans, I think, were out for half a day. The moment I heard about it, we stopped it. They were put back into their garage. And yet you remember the image. All of us do. It's very interesting. It's another very good example. It was stopped dead in its tracks within hours, I think.
But it wouldn't have started if you'd been Home Secretary. I mean,
no, but here's a really interesting point. So stick that through. So, funny enough, I've spoken to the Swedish Liberal leader about this recently, because in Sweden, the Liberals often go into coalition. And what they do is they occupy, in its entirety, one department. They normally do the Department for Education. Just imagine we'd done that. Just imagine we'd done Home Secretary and we'd done some more sort of libertarian things and so on. And Osborne would be allowed to run completely riot on many of the things he's done since 2000. And, I mean, by the way, again, the way it's retold doesn't bear the fact. Actually, inequality remained relatively stable between 2000 and 2015. If you look at the Institute for Fiscal Studies and others, they will tell you inequality is now set to absolute skyrocket because of decisions that we blocked. Just imagine we couldn't have blocked those. And instead said, oh no, but look, you know, we've done something else on civil liberties. I think that would have been seen quite rightly as a very poor return on our investment. But I accept the challenge, as I said earlier, which is that having fingerprints on almost every area of government policy, but not being seen to do so, I think that's the thing. I think that was the vice-like thing that was quite cruel for us.
We're up against time, I'm afraid. My colleagues are just waving at me to advise me. It's been hugely interesting to drill into everything in this much depth. Nick, I should say again, thanks to NatWest for sponsoring the room. I'll just say briefly about Prospect. We are one of the rare magazines that tries to give the Liberal Democrat voices a bit of room, which they often don't get in other publications. We had Vince write for us recently, as well as Ed Davin with the profile of Joe Scoots. Some colleagues there will tell you more about it and give you free wine if they can persuade you to sign up. But the most important thing I want to say is thank you so much, Nick, for making the time, for coming here, and you can see from the extraordinary turnout how many people are still absolutely determined to come along and hear what you've got to say. So I hope that's made it worthwhile. Thank you.